I'm using simple materials and techniques to make handmade kitchen miniatures and a very versatile open book. I have a big collection of 1/12 scale miniature books and a small collection of these half-scale books. Some of my books have mat board or cardboard pages. These books from Temu have foam in the middle. The book I'll be using to make an open book has paper pages, which is really important. These are really cheap, mass-produced 1/12 scale books with glued pages. To fake the look of an open book, I'm starting by splaying the pages by pushing against the edge and holding that in place with a Dollar Tree clip. This is a cheap, weak clip, so it won't dent the pages as much as a stronger clip. I'm doing both sides at the same time, and there are a couple ways to do this. I'm gluing the pages in this open position, and to get an immediate hold, I'm starting by adding hot glue to one end. To keep it from being too clunky and to press it into the pages, I'm using the tip to push it in. I have a bit of excess hot glue, so I'm carefully trimming that off with some small scissors. I really try to never have any visible glue of any type in my miniatures. If you don't want to use hot glue, you can skip this step and use the second method I'm showing. For the other side, I'm gluing the pages together using white glue. This is a much more seamless look, and this glue will disappear. The top white glue has dried, so now I took the clips off and I'm adding glue to the edges of the paper to make it more secure. I made more than I need because I learned from Little Gretchen's workshop you should make extras you can pull from your stash in the future. I'm making this look like a cookbook, but instead of drawing directly on the book, before I glued the pages shut, I pulled out 2 spare pages to use. I'm adding these pieces of paper to a popsicle stick with some Scotch double-sided tape. I made the tape less sticky by tapping it a few times with a paper towel. I have a miniature book with real typed words inside that can actually be read. It's a cool little book, but it's more useful to me if I can use the graphics. I tore out a page and cut a little square to add to one of my blank pieces of paper. I ended up needing to add some Mod Podge because the glue stick didn't cut it. To make this look like a cookbook, I drew some really simple drawings with a mechanical pencil, and I'm filling in a little bit of color with some colored pencil. I drew garlic, herbs, and some tomatoes. I'm dry fitting the page, and I can see that it's a little too long and overhangs the edge, so I'm cutting off a very thin sliver so the page will be in line with the other folded pages. For more detail, I used a very thin black marker and outlined some key areas, and then sealed the entire thing with matte Mod Podge to protect the pencil. This was so quick and easy. I'd love to make a spell book like this. I made a mini cookbook because this is a cooking scene, so right now I'm starting by making the base shape for some artichokes. I don't want this part to be too big because I'll be adding leaves. Because of the white color, the head and the tail, I unintentionally made these look like maracas. To make the leaves or petals of the artichoke, I'm rolling out some clay. I'm using polymer clay. To add a bit of color, I'm adding some chalk pastels. If you've been watching me for a while, you know I don't really make miniature food out of clay, so this is all an experiment to me. I'll be cutting out some clay leaves using these circle cutters I got from Temu recently. I'm using my tiny sperm artichoke base to figure out the size of the petals I want. I tried these before and the clay was left behind when I used these cutters, but I cut it a lot thinner this time, so I had to pop it out with a smaller size. I cut some of the smaller size, but mostly ended up using this size. I did realize it's faster and easier to cut a strip of squares and roll these into balls so they're nice and even without having to use the cutters. I started by covering the very end with a circle piece and added the small petals almost like it's a rose all around the edges. I pre-baked the base shape using my heat gun so it wouldn't become misshapen as I'm adding these petals. I added 2 overlapping rows of petals. At this size, the heat gun isn't a good substitute for the oven, so I'm baking all 3 of these so they'll be strong. My attempt at adding color wasn't great, so now I'm painting these pieces instead. One of these days I'll treat myself and go to Michael's and buy a few different colors of green paint, but in the meantime I used my 2 limited shades and some yellow to mix up my own artichoke green. Now I'm adding Waverly Antique Wax, which acts as a sealer and adds color. This is also subduing the green, making it look more natural and getting in between all of the details. I rolled them around in a paper towel to remove the excess. I lost one of my artichokes, so we'll see if I find it before the final beauty shots in the thumbnail photo. I'm trying out a new technique using more polymer clay to make a realistic stone mortar and pestle. I'm conditioning the clay by smushing it together in my warm hands. Natural stone has little bits of rocks that contrast in color and texture, so I'm using pepper for this. I'm using a pepper grinder because it gives you control over the coarseness of your pieces. This initial blast of pepper was too fine, so you can't really see it very well. I added much bigger pieces of pepper, and instead of folding them into the clay, I'm pressing them on the surface. To form the shape of a mortar, I'm using the end of a Sharpie. I flattened a piece of clay and I'm pressing it against the end of the marker. These organic edges are kind of cool, but we'll straighten that up with a craft knife. Cutting away the excess leaves a blunt edge, and I don't want to have to sand this later, so I'm gently tapping the edge with my finger to soften it. If I remove this polymer clay now, it'll probably become misshapen, so I'm using my heat gun to partially pre-bake it. This is a plastic marker that's filled with ink, so I'm keeping the heat gun moving so I don't accidentally melt the marker or cause any kind of damage to it. I'm keeping my fingers kind of close to it because if my fingers get too hot, I know the marker might be getting too hot. I baked it for about 1 minute with the heat gun, and I'm removing it after it cools so I don't misshapen it. Now I have the mortar, which is a vessel for grinding herbs and spices, so now I'm making the pestle. The pestle is super easy. It looks like an elongated teardrop. I kept rolling mine out until the size looked right in the mortar. Now I'm making some cutting boards, which are the perfect backdrop and platform for displaying miniature food. You don't need miter shears for this, but it does make the cutting a bit easier. You could make multiple passes with a craft knife instead. I'm using a tongue depressor to make this miniature cutting board, and I cut away the excess at the top and bottom. Now I'm using my craft knife to remove a big block of wood from either side of the handle. I think starting with the horizontal line is probably the best bet because it may prevent splitting, but this worked out just fine. The shape I traced out has nice curved edges and I have square cuts, so I'm using an emery board to soften these lines. If you're confident enough in your craft knife skills, you can use the blade to shave some of the pieces away, kind of like you're whittling or carving wood. This makes the sanding go faster because you're removing a bulk of the wood. I can hardly get through a project without using one of my super cheap files I got from Harbor Freight. I got 12 for $5. This is already shaping up nicely, but the blunt edges don't look very natural or realistic, so I softened all of those with my emery board. You can fake the look of a hole with a marker or create a real hole with a pin vise. To make this popsicle stick look a lot older, I'm using my craft knife to cut a V-shaped wedge out of the surface of the wood so it looks like a deep crack. The crack is on the top right, and I added 2 more. These become more visible once I add color. For some warmth, I'm using some cinnamon folk art paint. Wood tends to have natural variation, so I'm adding a couple stripes of that and then coming up with antique wax from Waverly. I dipped my paintbrush in water before I dipped it in the wax, and I'm wiping away the wet excess right away with a paper towel. I have some base tones established, so now I'm coming in with some full-strength Waverly antique wax and adding it to the surface. The surface is still a bit damp from the previous layer of wax. This wood had no variation at all before, and now it looks really natural and interesting. I'm using the stick from a hand fan I got at a wedding recently to make a round cutting board. I'm using the round end itself so I don't have to round as much of it, and I'm cutting away the excess using my miter shears even though it's cracking the wood. I'm going for a rustic appearance and I'm lazy and impatient, so I'm totally fine with dealing with the cracks if it means not having to cut it out myself with a craft knife. Just like I did previously, I softened all the cut edges with my emery board. To make some texture in the surface of this wood, I'm using the blunt end of my tweezers to pull some grooves into the piece. I've used a similar technique on rustic floorboards and I really love the texture it creates. To keep it from cracking all the way, I attached some paper towel on the back with wood glue and then gave it a full-strength coat of folk art cinnamon paint. I sprayed the round cutting board with water and wiped away the excess paint before adding a coat of dark wax from Waverly. To deepen the color, you can add a second coat. Using the same 2 products, I was able to achieve 2 different wood tones. Let me know if there's other miniature food you'd like for me to make or kitchen items. You can join my Patreon either as a free member or for $3 a month.